Hello, everyone. Excuse me. This is Mimi Ghez, and you're now on Gaining Footing in Private Donor Circles in the United States, a webinar which will help you learn how your nonprofit could be the next expert invited in. I'm honestly thrilled to have you on the call today and hope so much that you will take away from this exchange, which I hope will be interactive as possible, some concrete things that your organization can take home and do to bring your most innovative thinking to the donors in your field. That's my goal for you today. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first is that you are in listening mode. So you're in mute and you can hear me talk, but you can't talk to me. I cannot hear anything except for static on the line right now. Sounds like I'm talking to static, but I know you're there. So what you can do, and what I earnestly hope that you will do, is take a look at the chat box. That should be a drop-down menu on, I believe, the right-hand side of your computer screen where it says chat and questions. And I hope that during the course of the webinar, you will submit questions to me, questions that you came in with, questions you have about what donor networks are, anything that I say that strikes a chord but you're not exactly sure where I'm going with it, please, please. Write to me. I receive them on my end in a little chat box here. There's nothing here yet. Obviously, we're just getting started, but I'm hoping that as I begin to talk that this little chat area fills up with questions from you. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. The second thing I'd like to let you know is that I am recording this webinar. So just to let you know that we are in record mode. Also, I will be looking at concrete examples of a couple of nonprofit organizations that are on this call or whose issues are represented on this webinar sort of about halfway in. So I'm going to do a little bit of an overview for you about what donor networks are, why they're important, why they should be important to you in your long-range thinking about donor network, about donor engagement, donor relations in your work. And then we'll look at a couple of examples, actual organizations that could be doing concrete things in their development work to reach major donors in their field in a scope that probably they haven't before. So we'll do that about halfway through, and I hope that you'll still all be on the call for that. So moving on, let's look at the second slide. Who am I? My name is Mimi Ghez, and I'm president of a philanthropic advising company I started in 2002 called Echo Communications. About 2 years ago, actually more like 4 years ago, I started investigating the case of donor networks, and I did it for very personal reasons that I'd like to share with you. I was hired straight out of graduate school as a 23-year-old, sort of water behind my ears, communications specialist to a nonprofit domestic violence organization out in California, which was very small at the time, less than $1 million budget, which has now grown enormously and is one of the most significant forces in the entire world for domestic violence prevention issues. At that time, I was hired to develop and manage a program which was a public education initiative on domestic violence prevention. At that time, most of the money in the field at that time went to direct services, shelters, hotlines, police work, training, that kind of thing, judicial training. But there was very little money that went to look at what the American public could do, how to mobilize the American public in workplace settings, in community-based settings. What could you do if you actually knew a victim of domestic violence or a perpetrator of violence? What were steps that you could take? Most people didn't know at that time or know how important it was to even examine those issues in the funding world. So I was hired to take that on, and we eventually became an ad council campaign, and we generated $100 million worth of donated media and the praise of 2 sitting presidents, I'm very proud to say, because of all the work that we did. But what was stressful to me about it at the time was the fact that as a 23-year-old, I was asked to raise the money to cover the expenses for the annual budget of this campaign. It was called There's No Excuse for Domestic Violence. And the expenses totaled about $1 million a year. This was pre-recession, and even in those days, that was a lot of money, particularly for sort of marginalized issues, which domestic violence, this was pre-OJ, so in those times it still was. So one of the proudest accomplishments that I have truly in my life is the fact that I was able to do that year after year for the 8 years that I worked there. But it was difficult, and honestly, I lost a lot of sleep doing it. It was not comfortable to me, and I didn't have training. It wasn't my background. And when I left the NGO, the nonprofit organization, I came to Washington, and I had a White House fellowship. I worked at the Pentagon for a year, got interested in foreign policy issues, and then was hired by a foundation that I had long admired when I was doing fundraising, which is the Open Society Institute, which is now, as many of you would know, called the Open Society Foundations. And I was hired to develop a program that was a special initiative of the chairman's, George Soros's. It had just been created, and it had to do with how do you get Americans to care more about multilateral response to pursuing U.S. Foreign policy interests across the board, from human rights to the environment to international development to what have you. And I had a relatively small grant-making budget. I had only $1 million a year to spend, and this was a big goal. So most of my time, what I was charged with, literally in my job description, was to go from foundation to foundation, do whatever I could, basically, to translate our $1 million into something much more significant, and that's what we did. And one of the ways that we did that was one of the very first things that we did was to hold a meeting at the home of George Soros, the chairman of Open Society, to bring together the presidents of those foundations that care deeply about foreign policy issues. So I won't name them, but at his Bedford, New York home were all of the senior team leaders of the foreign policy driven foundations who were looking for a common agenda, things to fund in common, to think about in common, to pool their resources, essentially, in order to do philanthropy even more effectively. And I was in charge of putting together the program for Open Society Institute. And so there were 2 other foundations who were partners of ours, and together we developed an agenda for, to illuminate the conversation, to begin the conversation. It was a 2-day meeting in this setting. And what we did to do that, in order to do that, was we brought in issue experts who were not funders. One was a pollster from a communications company. One was a group that focused on sort of framing issues. How do you frame foreign policy issues when you speak about them publicly? And the third was the head of a very prominent think tank in the Washington, D.C. area. And each of them spoke to this group of very prominent donors. And even though I had helped to organize at a very senior level this meeting, as the meeting was happening, I was sitting there. I'll never forget the moment. It was really a big aha moment for me, where I was sitting at this meeting listening to these 3 issue experts talk to this group of donors about the issues that they are passionate about, and thinking privately to myself, my goodness, if I had known when I was doing fundraising and feeling so stressed about fundraising and trying to get ideas out about domestic violence prevention all those years ago, actually at that time it was only a year earlier, I would have been the first person on the airplane to go and visit my program officer, who was then Helen Newborn at the Ford Foundation, to sit down with her and say, thank you so much for the foundation's support that you give to us every year. You're such a faithful funder of this field. would you be willing, in addition to fund, not to fund, I'm sorry, but to consider us for a place within donor networks, so within donor networks that you might belong to. So I believe, for example, that the Ford Foundation belongs to the International Human Rights Funders Group. I'll have to double check that after the call, but that would have been a very relevant donor network for the work that the women's rights work that we were doing. And what I would have said is, I'm aware that this is a collection of donors who care, hundreds of donors who care about human rights issues, including women's rights and children's rights. Could you put us forward as an NGO speaker, issue expert at one of their annual conferences or one of their telebriefings on different issues that they do, or one of their annual conferences? In fact, they do 2 a year. And I'm quite certain that I mean, I can't speak for Helen, but I'm quite certain that there would have been a lively conversation, that there would have been interest in exploring something anyway if we had known to do that, but I didn't, and I regret that. It was a missed opportunity, and so that is the genesis of the program that I've now spent the last several years of my life creating. It's called, as you can see on the screen now, Hidden Opportunities for Grantees. And I start here by saying long-term donor engagement is hard work, and I know this, as I've said, from my own experience. But I also know from my experience on the other side of the fence as a grant maker that it doesn't always have to be as hard as it seems. Now, why is this? Let's look at donor networks. What are they? What are they? I've given you an example of a very informal one, the one that took place at George Soros' house. And these happen all the time, often in very exotic settings. Donors like to, as I did too, who wouldn't, go to islands and go to, places where they can enjoy themselves and explore the issues that they fund. And there needs to be, by definition, privacy for funders to be able to consider what their priorities are. And that's often why they go to kind of remote locations to do this kind of work. But there are many, many, many other kinds of donor gatherings that happen on a regular basis that are not informal. They're institutionalized, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. And here's one of the places in the presentation where I want your ears to prick up. And I also, if you have questions for me, I want you to go ahead and put them in. I don't see any now. I'm just checking screen. Yes, okay, so please let me just ask you if you have questions to send them my way so I can get to them in the course of the conversation. I don't see any here now. What are donor networks? So principally what started to happen, the first one was formed in 1938 in Michigan, but principally they began to form around the 1970s, 1980s. And what happened was, way before the 70s and the 80s, people who gave money away, foundations, corporations, in different ways, they came together in a formal sense. They would come together for annual conferences to discuss the state of philanthropy. They would, legal issues. How do you set up a foundation? How do you keep it in compliance with the law? Can you lobby? Can you not lobby? All those kinds of issues were regularly discussed. But what began to happen around about that time, as I'm saying, the 70s and 80s, is that at these kinds of conferences, the education donors would sort of start to look for each other and say, oh, it'd be so great to have a place where only education donors, not to be exclusive, but simply only education donors could sort of sit down together at a table or have a place that's separate in order to discuss not so much philanthropy as a general field, but the specific issues that have to do with the current state of play of philanthropy with respect to education, whether it's K through 12 or it's access to education issues or it's funding for education, whatever it is. There are so many issues that these funders began to find in common that they found that they didn't have the place or the time or the space to discuss them in the kind of depth that they wanted to. They wanted their own space. So what started to happen is that a group called the Council on Foundations, which is probably the country's largest, biggest philanthropic organization. It has about 1,700 members, foundation and some corporate members. They started to assist with the formation of so-called foundation issue-based affinity groups. which are donor networks based on issues. And there are 41 of them that are officially recognized by the Council on Foundations. There are countless others who are not recognized by the Council, either because they're local or they don't meet the criteria for other reasons. The Council focuses on national networks of donors. So there are 41 national networks of issue-based donors. So, for example, I'm going to flip here to the next screen so you can see just a few, and keep in mind that I selected just some of the ones that I've been looking at. Oops, I put this in the wrong order. I'll have to come back to this. Send your questions in. Okay, sorry about that. Here we are. So I put up here the questions that the networks that I've been looking at lately, but keep in mind, again, that there are 41 of them that are formally recognized. There are hundreds more that are not. So Grantmakers for Health, it's a collection of probably 300, if I had to make a guess, looking at their donor list, donors who care about improving the health and welfare of Americans, and they fund in different ways. They fund access issues, they fund dental care, they fund insurance issues, they look at the role of community-based organizations in health delivery, et cetera. And just a few, just so you can see that you can understand as a nonprofit, if you are one, why this is so significant. Their members, the people who pay dues to create this organization. So there's 300 donors, such as the Morris and Gwendolyn Caffritz Foundation, which is one of the biggest DC-based foundations in the city, the California Endowment, one of the most important healthcare funders in the state of California, along with the California Wellness Foundation, which is also a member of Grantmakers in Health, the Colorado Trust, which is also a very important funder in the state of Colorado, and so on. The Commonwealth Fund, another well-known, I believe, New York-centric, New York-based philanthropic organization, is also a member of Grantmakers in Health. So 300 of these types of donors pay annual dues. So what they do is, they pay anywhere between, in general, not just for Grantmakers in Health, something like, could be $500, could be $16,000 or more, depending on the size of their grant-making budget. They pay money to an organization called Grantmakers in Health. And what Grantmakers in Health does with the dues of its members, it's hired staff, it now has board members that oversee its activities, and it runs donor education events for its 300-plus members so that it fulfills the following function. It allows grantmakers who care in health to find a space together where they can network, trade business cards, trade information with each other, learn from each other, learn who is funding what their budgets are, who's funding which grantees that are interesting. They start to share, it's very common that one donor who is, sort of say given $300,000 to a grantee will come to a Grantmakers in Health, say, meeting, could be any of these, but they call it Grantmakers in Health, to try to seek co-donors for that $300,000 contribution that they've made to their grantee, so that that grantee is able to attain sustainability, so that the programming continues, and frankly, so that donor isn't liable for yet another significant grant request from the same grantee the next year, which is also part of the motivation, of course, for sharing information with these networks. And on and on. There's an Environmental Grantmakers Association. I know some of the people on the call focus on the environment, so this is a very important grantmaker network for environmental NGOs. They are based in New York City. They have an annual conference, took place in 2012 at the end of the year in upstate New York. Lots of interesting speakers. About 30 nonprofits made it to the agenda as issue-based speakers. Grantmakers in the Arts, it's a collection of donors, also a very large number of donors across the United States who care about culture issues and funding culture, just as Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, the last one I'm featuring on the screen here, they care about issues impacting families, such as child care, Head Start, early education, that kind of thing. There are also issue-based, in addition to issue-based grantor networks, there are also 34 geography-based clusters of major donors. It's essentially the same kind of thing as issue-based donors. It's simply that the focus of these groups is geography as opposed to issues. So for example, let me give you a couple of examples so you can see. And again, there are 34 of them in the United States. I'm giving you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just about every state in the country has a regional, so-called a geography-based donor network, but not every single one. There are some states that they either don't have the capacity or the will or what have you to create one, and so they rely on so-called regional clusters of donors that care about a particular region, multi-state region, rather than one state. But here you see Illinois has one, Donors Forum. Florida has one for the entire state of Florida. Florida actually has more than one, just as California has 3 of them. Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers is the DC-based one. Arizona has one. And Southeastern Council of Foundations represents 11 states, the interests of donors who reside in 11 states in the Southeast. And similarly, there are collections of donors who come together because they want to build relationships with other donors. If I'm in Illinois, I want to know other people who fund in Illinois, so that if I've given $200,000 to the Art Institute of Chicago, for example, this is purely hypothetical, but an institution I admire. I'm from Chicago. So if I'm a donor who's given that amount of money, it's in my interest to know other donors in Illinois who might be persuaded to match my $200,000 with another $200,000, so that maybe next year the program is even more effective, sustainable, and maybe I'm not liable for another request for another couple of years. That kind of thing. And same thing happens in Florida, DC, Arizona, and in the 11 states that the Southeastern Council on Foundation represents. I'm certain of that. And each of these has donor members who pay dues to them, which are, they range anywhere from 75 members to upwards of 300 members, and they're all, as I gave to you with the example of Grantmakers in Health, they're all really major donors. We're not talking about small potatoes here, although anyone is welcome. All funders are welcome. Funders can be foundations, they can be corporate, and they can be major individual givers, although there are limits, and that's not the right word, limit. Particularly with individual donors, it's not $50 contributors that they allow in. Generally speaking, it's people who give above a certain level, like, for example, could be $50,000 who are eligible for joining some of these networks. But in any case, they're large donors who are members and who get together. So once again, questions, please send them in. Why does this matter? Sorry for the scrolling around. Let me tell you why it matters. And here's another place where I want your ears to prick up. Each of these donor networks, the issue-based ones and the geography-based ones, each of them have educational platforms for their donors. They are created to support the agenda of their donors. So they're called differently in different networks. Some of them have some of these options, but not all of them. Some of the bigger networks have all of these options. But what you're going to find at least one of these in each of the donor networks that I'm mentioning. That the staff of these donor networks will invite NGO leaders like yourself, if you are one, to become an issue expert on issues that their donors are interested in. So if you're Grantmakers in Health, you're going to do annual surveys to understand what your 300 donors care about, what aspects of health your donors care about. It could be insurance issues. It could be, as I say, access issues, the role of what's happening with veterans, mental health issues. It could be, it's lots of different aspects that they find out their donors are interested in. So what do they do with that? They seek out, via their donors and also on their own, issue experts, nonprofit issue experts, to talk about those issues to their donors, so that their donors understand what the latest thinking is in these areas, whether it's mental health or access or insurance or the role of community-based organizations or what have you. I'm just looking at the health example now. And those grantees will be invited to speak on, looking at the screen now, audio conferences on these select topics. So that means that you, if you're that donor that's, the grantee that's been selected, that means that you are speaking just as I am speaking to you. You are the one speaking on a conference call with, maybe 50 donors, depends how many, sign up and actually attend and listen. You are the one telling them about your innovative solutions to those problems of access and health insurance and what have you. You are guiding them to what is interesting in the field, what is impacting on the community level, and what is interesting to fund. There are also, the second item that you'll see, there are annual meetings. Almost every, if not all, of these donor networks hold annual meetings at least once a year. Some of them hold 2 annual meetings where they bring together all of their donors, however many will come anyway, to spots around the country. The Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Family, for example, I'm a member of this donor network, and they met in El Paso last October, even though they're based in Silver Spring, Maryland, in order to understand immigration issues and transborder issues, and it was fascinating. And at these meetings, nonprofit organizations are invited to the podium, in that case, nonprofit organizations that care about children's issues, do children's advocacy work that's really cutting edge and interesting for funders to learn about. And they sit on the panels, they hear, they tell donors what's happening in the field and why it matters. And they're the subject of site visits. Like, for example, in El Paso, we went around town to visit various El Paso-based nonprofit organizations that are doing interesting work to learn about it. Spent an entire afternoon doing that. Webinars for donors, the third item here, happens all the time. There was a webinar just yesterday at the International Human Rights Funders Group that focused on China's role in Africa. There's Environmental Grantmakers Association is very active about doing webinars. I think they did one on the role of youth in organizing around environmental issues at one point, if I'm not mistaken, a few months ago. Publications, Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, they invite nonprofit organizations to author policy articles about cutting-edge solutions to the issues that they care about, like child care and Head Start, and they send these policy publications to their 300-plus network of donors. I think it's, don't quote me on the 300, I'm not sure, but it's a large network. Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers has a blog. They talk about interesting developments in the field, mentioning what's going on and who's doing what. Site visits we just talked about. Policy briefing programs. Peace and Security Funders Group, which is a collection of 75 funders who care about peace and security issues, based in Charlottesville, Virginia. They hold a regular policy briefing program here in DC where they examine sort of federal policy implications of various security issues, including, for example, Afghanistan. And they invite many different NGO leaders to speak about, potential solutions to, whether it's troop withdrawal or health repercussions for the veterans when they come home, or what, how do we keep Congress regularly apprised about what's going on over there. NGO leaders are invited to speak about that effectively, and this happens all the time. So these are precious environments for nonprofits. I cannot stress for you this enough. It's a chance to, if it's you sitting at that podium, whether it's 24 donors that you're speaking to or it's 200, and believe me when I tell you it could be either. If it's you on the podium, it's a chance to educate. This is what I care. This is how I got into the field. This is what you hear in my voice now. it's a chance for you to educate donors in your field about the solutions that you believe matter. So what I would have wanted so much when I was head of the No Excuse for Domestic Violence campaign was a chance to speak to a collection of hundreds of donors about why violence prevention, is a strategy equal to victim response, which is where a lot of the money was going, as I said earlier. And it's a chance for you, whatever your issue is, to stand on the podium and to talk about what is movement building, what is working in your movement. Now, of course, it's also a chance for you to collect and follow up on the business cards of the, that you collect of the 24, 50, 100, whatever it is, people listening to you speak. It's new relationships with funders that you can pursue. It's new funding sources that happen all the time for people in these positions. I can give you example after example. It's the ability to let donors in your field know about your good work, your organization's work, and about how they might spend their dollars differently into the future. They're spending, we don't know this one. Their grant-making portfolios. Okay, now here's an example which I want to talk with you about. You might be, if you're asking yourself, if you're still asking yourself, why does this matter for me? You're talking about donor networks, and I'm not a donor. I want to give you an example, and that's the Polaris Project. I'm a member, or I have been a member, of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, which is it's the geography-based network for the DC area. And I went over the summer last year to a presentation that was made on the topic of human trafficking in the DC area. And I got interested because I was really horrified. I couldn't believe that it happens here, because you don't hear about it much, but apparently it does. And a man named Bradley Miles, who's executive director of the Polaris Project, was invited along with another expert in the field to speak about the impact of the problem locally. And he came and he made a very eloquent presentation. He had, let me tell you this too, at the table at the back of the room, for donors who were in attendance, where he was able to lie out his business card, his annual reports, his fact sheets, his brochures, and donors after the presentation collected them all and took them away with them. So that was an incredible opportunity for him to give his materials to donors and to interface with them. And I picked up with a phone with him I called him the other day, and just to understand better, how did it go and what came out of it for him. And he said that he had had a number of telephone calls from donors in attendance, and that straight off the bat he had received a $10,000 check. Now this, as I say, it's one example that I can give you of an organization that got in and that was able to persuasively speak to a group of, as I say, probably 24 donors, and to be supported financially afterwards. There are many, many others. So I want to take, let me just take bear with me, I'm just going to look at it and see if we have questions here. How do we go on the podium to speak? Okay, that's someone has asked, how can we go on the podium to speak? So let me answer that by way of, I requested the, what's the word? I reached out to an organization called Student Immigration Movement, who I knew was participating on this call, to ask them if I could use them as an example to answer that question, to tell you how you can go about how these opportunities can be you. So what she told me was that they receive a very significant amount of money from the HIAMS Foundation, which is a Boston-based foundation, which I know actually decently well and have spoken with some folks over there myself. And what I know is that they are members of Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, which is one of the Grantmaker networks that I mentioned earlier. They're also a member to Grantmakers concerned about refugees, or immigrants and refugees, I think it is. It could be refugees and immigrants. I could be getting that wrong. But in any case, that is a collection of many, many major donors and corporations across the country who care about the impact of immigration in all dimensions, particularly in the sense of safety, human safety, also in terms of access issues. And the other network that the HIAMS Foundation belongs to is Grantmakers for Education, which is another one of the largest collection of donors, sort of issue-based donors. It's based in Portland and it probably has 300 donors, major education funders. And so now, and I'm telling you this because I know that this is part of what my Hidden Opportunities business is about, is allowing groups to understand who their donors are connected to so that they can make these kinds of asks. But so because I know this and can tell students immigration movement on the call here, what I would do if I were you is to reach out to your program officer, whoever it is, and to say, to ask for a meeting or write a letter saying, beginning by saying, we're so grateful to you for the X amount of money that you've generously given to us over the years, and here's the kind of impact that you've made possible. What we would like to do is sit down and explore with you the possibility of our group becoming an issue briefer at grantmaker meetings of grantmakers concerned about immigrants and refugees and grantmakers for children, youth, and families, for example, and perhaps also to grantmakers for education. That would be a very powerful thing to do. They wouldn't have to give you another penny. It would all be a non-financial donation that they would be giving you that could, if you end up on a webinar or in a speaking spot, it would be, I don't want to say equal to a grant because money is money, of course, everyone knows, but it could be equally significant in the end if you end up on that spot. One thing is important to know is that these are non-solicitation environments, and they're very strictly so. So if you do end up in a donor network setting as a speaker, you cannot ask for money directly at the meeting. It's really important to abide by this. It's about donor education. You're there to be the act as the issue expert to donors who are trying to learn how to fund their issues even better. What you can do, however, and there's no law against it, and in fact I think it would be criminal not to, would be to collect the business cards of the people that are most interested in what you've said in your presentation, and to follow up with them. A week later, a couple weeks later, say, would love to set up a call with you, or if you're in the same city with them, have breakfast with you and discuss, further implications. The kind of thing that any good fundraiser would do. From there, it's a fundraising proposition, but the difference is between writing a proposal where you're writing proposals one by one, instead you're speaking to an audience of dozens of donors and collecting an enormous number of business cards in a single day. Let's see. Another example I want to give, because I just want to give you the breadth of what's possible here. So there's a group on the call called the Story of Stuff, which I know of because I've done some research into a donor network meeting that they spoke at, which was the 2010 Council on Foundations annual conference. And also, they were also a speaker at the 2012 Environmental Grantmakers Association annual conference in upstate New York. As I mentioned, they were one of the 30 groups that were spotlighted there. And so one thing that I would do for them, this is a different approach because it's a group that's actually had some experience, some leadership experience really, in this way. For that group, what I would consider doing is to write a note to the groups who were in attendance at your presentation in 2010 at the Council on Foundations meeting in Denver, and also to the ones that were in attendance at the 2012 meeting of the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and tell them what the impact of the meeting was on you. I think that they would absolutely treasure hearing back as a donor member of a network. They would treasure hearing back from an NGO to know how it impacted you and your issues potentially. And also to say what you've been able to do since that time that they might be, want to be aware of. And at the bottom of the note, request a time to speak in person or on the phone. That's another strategy. And I'll give you one more, because again, I think the more that you hear these kinds of things, the more, like me, you might get excited about just the endless approach. I'm giving you some examples here, but truly, the ways that you can approach this topic are truly endless, just about endless. So there's a group on the call that focuses on security and climate issues, which is something that I have a personal interest in myself and care deeply about. And we've talked a bit, and I know that a good amount of effort on the part of your donors is already going toward getting you into a visible role within environmental funder networks, and also into either via speaking roles that they're arranging for you, or via kind of speaking roles that the donor is willing to play for themselves, that they're willing to take on a great deal of visibility for your work as your collaborator, as your sort of donor collaborator. And so one of the things that I was thinking about for you, and I'm sorry for pausing for just a moment, I was actually just looking for my list here of affinity groups recognized by the Council on Foundations, and that is that if you haven't reached out to particular kind of niche audiences, or not niche, but audiences where you can speak with people in an ethnic-specific or race-specific way about security and climate issues, then I think perfect kind of networks for you to consider approaching or asking one of your donors for help approaching might be Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. That's one. It's a San Francisco-based, I believe, funders network that enhances Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and their issues. There's also a funders network called Hispanics in Philanthropy, which similarly cares about and invests itself in philanthropy having to do with the impact of issues on Hispanics, the Hispanic community. So, and then there's also the Jewish Funders Network, which, as you can imagine, is a similar network, but focused on Jewish community concerns. So that's another approach that could be worthwhile for you. Is looking at sort of target constituencies and how to involve them in your work. So as we end the webinar, let me just tell you, Hidden Opportunities, it's a set of services, tools, consulting, coaching, and educational videos that will help you be the one that's the next one at the podium. It will help you be fully aware of all of the donor networks that exist on your issues and gain maximum confidence about how to approach your donors about their willingness to get you on the agenda, and B, become that next speaker who gains visibility for your great ideas. We're offering here a really special offer for our 8 Days of Hidden Opportunities program, which is a program where I spend 8 days, 45 minutes a day for 8 weeks, 8 consecutive weeks, doing exactly what we did just now, looking at the case of the student environmental movement, security and climate, and the story of stuff. We'll go over your case, you know, for 8 weeks, and we will find all of the opportunities that exist for you. And by the end of this time, there'll be homework in between. I'll tell you, by the end of this time, you will have made major requests of your donors for visibility and for their help in this. And I guarantee you, from personal experience, having been the person that puts people on these podiums in this role, it makes a difference. So it's been my absolute pleasure. I'll skip this slide because I'm already a minute over here. It's just been my absolute pleasure speaking with you all today and talking with you all about, you know, donor networks and why it makes sense to invest time learning up all about this. You know, it could be you collecting those business cards from dozens of donors, and it could be you persuading donors to fund initiatives you feel are undervalued by the funding world. I guarantee it to you from personal experience. And please do email me with any questions, or call 202-375-0743, or email Mimi, M-I-M-I, .ghez, G-H-E-Z, at echocommunications.net, or the number that's on the screen now, info@echocommunications.net. Many, many thanks, and good luck.